The cliff face drops 3,000 feet straight down into Devil's Canyon, where even mountain goats refuse to tread. Here, suspended between heaven and certain death, Marcus Chen hammers another steel beam into solid granite while winds howl at 80 miles per hour. 6 months ago, he was Seattle's most celebrated structural engineer until the Meridian Tower collapse killed 12 people and buried his career in lawsuits and shame. Now he's building something that defies every law of physics and engineering he once swore by, a house that shouldn't exist, clinging to rock that shouldn't hold it. But Marcus isn't running from his past anymore. He's building toward a truth that powerful people tried to bury with those 12 bodies. The blueprints hidden in his cabin don't just show innovative construction techniques, they reveal why someone sabotaged his tower and framed him for murder. Every beam he places brings him closer to exposing a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. The question isn't whether his impossible house will stand, it's whether Marcus will live long enough to finish it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus paused, his safety harness the only thing between him and oblivion, and wiped sweat from his eyes despite the frigid mountain air. The steel beam groaned as another gust threatened to tear it from his grip. His muscles screamed in protest, but he'd learned to ignore pain months ago when the nightmares started. 12 faces haunted his sleep, construction workers who'd trusted his calculations, who'd died when Floor 47 pancaked down through the building like dominoes. The official report blamed him. Structural miscalculation, professional negligence, criminal incompetence. The media had crucified him before the investigation even concluded. But Marcus knew better. He'd triple-checked those load-bearing specifications himself. The steel had been rated for twice the stress it encountered that day. A raven landed on the beam he'd just secured, cocking its head as if questioning his sanity. Marcus almost laughed. Even the wildlife thought he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Sane men didn't attempt to anchor a 2-story structure into a vertical cliff face using only climbing gear and determination. The satellite phone in his pack buzzed, his lawyer again, probably with another settlement offer. The families deserved compensation, but not from him, not when he was innocent. He ignored the call and reached for the next beam. That's when he saw the black SUV. It was barely a speck on the mountain road below, but Marcus had developed paranoid eyes over the past 6 months. 3 times now, he'd spotted vehicles that had no business being in this remote wilderness. Each time, they disappeared when he tried to get a closer look. His hand instinctively went to the waterproof document case clipped to his harness. Inside were photocopies of the real blueprints, the ones he'd found hidden in his mentor's effects after Professor Hendrick's convenient heart attack 2 weeks after the collapse. The blueprints that showed the Meridian Tower had been designed to fail, with stress points deliberately weakened to create maximum casualties. The question was why? Why murder 12 innocent people? Why destroy his reputation? The answer had to be in the building's purpose. A government annex that housed 3 federal agencies. Someone had wanted those offices destroyed and everyone in them dead. The collapse hadn't been about construction, it had been about elimination. Marcus secured his tools and began the careful descent to his temporary shelter, a reinforced lean-to he'd built against the cliff face. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. One mistake here meant death, and he couldn't afford to die with secrets. As he rappelled down, his mind wandered to the house taking shape above him. The design was revolutionary, a cantilevered structure that used the cliff's natural compression points and wind patterns to actually strengthen itself under stress. It was engineering poetry, the kind of innovation that should have made him famous instead of infamous. But the house wasn't just architectural defiance, it was a message. When completed, it would be visible from the highway below, a testament to what was possible when someone refused to accept failure. More importantly, it would be a fortress, solar-powered, communications-equipped, and virtually impregnable, the perfect hideout for a man with dangerous knowledge Marcus touched down on the narrow ledge and checked his equipment. Tomorrow he'd install the foundation anchors for the living quarters. If his calculations were correct, and they always were, the structure would be completed within 6 weeks. If he lived that long. The SUV had disappeared, but that didn't mean he was safe. They'd killed Hendrik and framed Marcus for mass murder. They wouldn't hesitate to arrange a climbing accident for a disgraced engineer who'd ventured too far into the wilderness. As darkness fell over Devil's Canyon, Marcus lit his camp stove and heated a can of beans. Somewhere out there, powerful people were sleeping peacefully, believing they'd buried their secrets with the Meridian Tower. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The house would stand, the truth would emerge, and Marcus Chen would have his vindication even if he had to build it one impossible beam at a time. The rental truck's engine wheezed as Marcus downshifted around another hairpin turn, the road narrowing to barely 2 lanes of cracked asphalt. Pine trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against the truck's mirrors like skeletal fingers. 3 hours from Denver, and civilization had gradually peeled away until only wilderness remained. His phone had lost signal 20 miles back. Good. The last thing he needed was another call from a reporter or, worse, another lawyer representing families who'd lost everything when the Meridian Tower came down. 43 people. The number haunted his dreams, carved itself into his consciousness every time he closed his eyes. But it wasn't his miscalculation that brought down that building. The realization had come too late, buried in subsection amendments to the original blueprints, amendments that hadn't existed in his copy of the plans. Someone had altered the structural specifications after his approval, weakening critical support beams by 30%. When he'd tried to present this evidence, his files had mysteriously corrupted, his backup drives wiped clean. The only copy of the original plans had disappeared from the architectural firm's servers the day after the collapse. Marcus pulled into the gravel lot of Henley's General Store, a weathered building that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s. A bell chimed as he pushed through the door, and the smell of old wood and motor oil enveloped him. Behind the counter, a man with a grey beard looked up from a hunting magazine. "Help you? I need supplies for a building project. Remote location, off-grid." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. How remote? About 15 miles up Forest Service Road 347, near Widow's Ridge. The magazine slapped shut. "Widow's Ridge? Son, ain't nothing up there but sheer rock and bad memories. What kind of fool builds on a cliff face? The kind who knows what he's doing." "That's what everybody we've pulled off those rocks said." The man stood, his joints creaking. "Name's Bill Henley. Been running this store 42 years, and I've seen plenty of city folk come up here with grand plans. Most of 'em head back down after their first night, hearing the wind howl through those peaks." Marcus extended his hand. "Marcus Cole. And I'm not going back down." Something in his tone made Henley study him more carefully. "Cole. That name sounds familiar." "Probably not." Marcus pulled out a handwritten list. "I need cement, rebar, basic tools and climbing gear. Whatever you can't supply, who can?" Henley scanned the list, his eyebrows climbing higher with each item. "This is serious hardware. You planning to build a bunker?" "Something like that." "Well, I got most of this, but you'll need to talk to Miguel Santos for the specialized climbing equipment. Runs the mountaineering shop in Millbrook, about 40 minutes south." Henley leaned against the counter. "Mind if I ask what you're running from?" The question hit closer to home than Marcus liked. "Who says I'm running? Man doesn't choose to build on Widow's Ridge unless he's either running from something or towards something equally dangerous. And you don't strike me as the spiritual vision quest type." Marcus pulled out his wallet, but Henley raised a hand. "Look, I don't know your story, and maybe I don't want to, but that ridge has claimed 11 lives in the past 20 years. Rock slides, equipment failures, falls. The Ute used to say the mountain doesn't want to be disturbed. I'll take my chances." Henley shrugged and began pulling items from the shelves. As he worked, he kept glancing at Marcus with an expression that suggested he was trying to place him. The last thing Marcus needed was recognition. The Meridian Tower collapse had been national news, his face plastered across every engineering journal and half the newspapers in the country. Marcus froze. What kind of fellow? City type, expensive clothes, soft hands. Said he was with some environmental group, worried about construction disrupting wildlife habitats. Henley's eyes met Marcus's. Funny thing, though, he didn't seem to know much about wildlife, kept asking specific questions about building permits and land surveys. A chill ran down Marcus's spine. 2 weeks ago, he'd finalized the purchase of the Ridge property through a shell corporation, thinking he'd covered his tracks. Apparently not well enough. He leave a name? Called himself Johnson. Paid cash for a topographical map of the area and directions to the Ridge access road. Henley loaded the last of the supplies onto a cart. You want my advice? Whatever you're mixed up in, that Ridge won't hide you from it. Some things follow you wherever you go. Marcus handed over cash for the supplies, his mind racing. If they'd found him this quickly, building on the Ridge wasn't just about proving his design concepts anymore. It might be about staying alive. The morning mist clung to the cliff face like a shroud as Marcus checked his equipment for the 3rd time. The harness felt foreign against his body. It had been 15 years since his rock climbing days at MIT, back when he thought physics was just an elegant dance of forces rather than a merciless judge of his failures. He clipped the first anchor into the rock, testing its hold with a sharp tug. The limestone held firm, its surface rough and honest under his calloused fingers. Unlike the polished lies of the Meridian Tower blueprints, this rock wouldn't deceive him. It wouldn't hide load-bearing miscalculations behind corporate signatures and rushed deadlines. The rappel down the cliff face should have terrified him, but Marcus found an odd peace in the controlled fall. Each foot of descent was measured, deliberate, everything the Meridian project hadn't been. The wind whipped across the valley below, carrying the scent of pine and the distant rumble of the river that had carved this canyon over millennia. Patient work, honest work. Halfway down, he found what he'd spotted through his surveyor's scope, a natural shelf barely wide enough for a man to stand on, protected by an overhang that had weathered 10,000 storms. Most engineers would see impossible geometry, a suicide mission dressed as architecture. Marcus saw possibility. His satellite phone buzzed against his hip. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Sarah Chen, his former project manager, the only person besides him who'd seen the real blueprints before they'd been corrected. You need to stop, her voice crackled through the static, urgent and afraid. They know where you are, Marcus. They know what you're building. Building a house isn't a crime, Sarah. He wedged himself against the rock face, checking over his shoulder at the empty valley. Nothing moved except the wind through the trees. Cut the shit. You think they're idiots? A disgraced engineer suddenly decides to build on the most impossible site in Colorado. They know you're using the calculations, the real ones. Marcus closed his eyes. The equations were burned into his memory, not the fabricated load distribution that had killed 17 people, but the original structural analysis he'd completed before Douglas Crane and his corporate masters had demanded adjustments for cost savings. The real mathematics were elegant, revolutionary even. They could change how engineers approached impossible builds. The world deserves to know the truth about what happened, he said. The world deserves not to have you dead in some ravine. Sarah's voice broke. They killed Petrov last week, made it look like a heart attack, but Viktor was healthier than men half his age. Viktor Petrov, the Russian materials engineer who'd signed off on the original Meridian specifications before they'd been altered. Marcus felt the cliff face sway, though he knew it was just his perception tilting. The blueprints I left with you, destroyed. Had to. They came to my apartment the night after Petrov died, asking questions. Marcus, these people don't just ruin careers, they're cleaning house. A raven landed on the overhang above him, regarding Marcus with black, intelligent eyes. In the distance, he could hear the faint drone of an engine, unusual for this remote section of the canyon. His hand instinctively moved to the encrypted thumb drive in his jacket pocket, the one containing every calculation that proved the Meridian collapse could have been prevented. How long do I have? I don't know. Maybe they think you'll just drink yourself to death up there like some tragic hermit, but if you actually succeed in building this thing, if it proves your theories work— Sarah's silence spoke volumes. The engine sound was getting closer. Marcus squinted across the valley and caught a glint of sunlight off metal, a black SUV winding up the Forest Service road that dead-ended 3 miles from his camp. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me." He pulled out the thumb drive, weighing it in his palm. Such a small thing to hold so much destruction and possibility. "There's a package in my truck. If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you because you're going to pack up and disappear. Tonight. Go to Mexico, change your name, find a nice beach somewhere, and design vacation homes for rich gringos." The Raven cawed once and took flight, wings catching the updraft from the valley. Marcus watched it soar toward the peaks, free and unencumbered by the weight of truth. "I can't run anymore," he said finally. "If I don't prove these calculations work, if I don't show the world what really happened at Meridian, then those 17 people died for nothing. And the next building Crane Industries cuts corners on will kill 17 more." The phone went silent except for static. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was hollow with resignation. "Then build something impossible, Marcus. Build something that can't be torn down." The line went dead, leaving him suspended between earth and sky, with nothing but rock, wind, and the mathematics of the impossible to keep him alive. Marcus wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the first day's work. The initial anchor points were set, 4 massive bolts driven deep into the granite face, each one tested with 3 times the expected load. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley below, and he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Despite what the experts claimed, the cliff was speaking to him in the language he understood best: stress, compression, and the immutable laws of physics. The satisfaction evaporated when he spotted the dust cloud rising from the access road far below. A vehicle was approaching, winding its way up the mountain path that barely qualified as a road. Marcus had chosen this location specifically for its isolation, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, and accessible only by 4-wheel drive. Visitors weren't welcome, and they certainly weren't expected. He scrambled down the temporary scaffold system he'd rigged against the cliff face, his boots finding purchase on the metal rungs with practiced ease. By the time he reached his base camp, a collection of weathered tarps stretched between pine trees, the sound of an engine was echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus grabbed his binoculars from the equipment cache and focused on the approaching vehicle, a black SUV with government plates. His blood turned to ice water. After 18 months of blissful anonymity, they'd found him. Marcus lowered the binoculars and forced himself to breathe steadily. Running wasn't an option. There was nowhere to go except down a 1,000-foot cliff or deeper into wilderness that would kill him before any human could. He would have to face whatever was coming. The SUV pulled into the small clearing where Marcus had left his battered pickup truck. 2 figures emerged, both wearing the kind of dark suits that screamed federal authority. The driver was a woman in her 40s with steel-grey hair pulled back severely. Her companion was younger, early 30s, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. "Mr. Chen?" The woman's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "I'm Agent Sarah Reeves, FBI. This is Agent Torres. We need to speak with you." Marcus stepped out from behind the trees, keeping his hands visible. "This is private property." "Yes, we know. 40 acres purchased 18 months ago through a shell corporation registered in Delaware." Reeves approached with confident strides, seemingly unbothered by the rough terrain. "Impressive paper trail, almost like you were trying to disappear. I value my privacy. Is that illegal now?" "Depends what you're hiding." Torres had circled around, positioning himself to block any retreat toward the tree line. These weren't routine investigators. They moved like hunters. Reeves stopped 10 feet away, close enough to study his face. "You've been difficult to track down, Mr. Chen. No credit cards, no cell phone, no digital footprint at all for over a year. Very old school. I pay cash and mind my own business. What do you want? To discuss the Morrison Tower collapse. Specifically, what you discovered in those blueprints that you haven't shared with anyone. The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. After all this time, after the investigations and hearings and media circus, they were still digging, which meant someone with real power was afraid of what he might know. I told the review board everything. Design flaw in the load-bearing calculations. My mistake, my responsibility, case closed. Reeves smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We both know that's not the whole truth. You spent 3 weeks going through those blueprints with a microscope after the collapse. Your former colleague said you found something that changed your entire perspective on what happened. Then, suddenly, you stopped cooperating, took responsibility for everything, and vanished. Marcus's mind raced. How could they know about those final weeks? He'd been careful, paranoid even, working alone in his apartment after the FBI and insurance investigators had finished their initial sweep. What he'd discovered in those blueprint revisions had terrified him more than any professional disgrace. Sometimes accepting responsibility is the mature thing to do, he said carefully. Torres spoke for the first time. 12 people died when that building came down, including 2 kids. If someone else was responsible, those families deserve to know. And if certain people covered up evidence, Reeves added, they need to be held accountable. We think you can help us do that. The late afternoon breeze shifted, carrying the scent of pine and granite dust. Far below, a hawk circled lazily above the valley floor. Marcus thought about the quiet months he'd spent up here, planning his impossible house, trying to forget everything he'd learned in those blueprints. The evidence of systematic corruption that went far beyond one building collapse. The names of people who would kill to keep their secrets buried. I don't know what you think I can tell you, Marcus said finally. Reeves reached into her jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. Maybe this will refresh your memory. We found Daniel Morrison's private files last week, including his correspondence with certain city officials about expedited permits and inspection schedules. She held out the envelope, and Marcus found himself staring at proof that his carefully constructed isolation was over. Whatever was in those files, it was enough to bring federal agents to his mountain sanctuary. The game had begun again. The wind carried the sound before Marcus could see its source, the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades cutting through mountain air. He dropped his welding torch and scrambled to the edge of his platform, peering down through the morning haze. A dark helicopter circled the base of the cliff like a predator testing its prey. His hands trembled as he reached for the binoculars. The aircraft bore no markings, its sleek black hull reflecting nothing but menace. Through the cockpit glass, he could make out 2 figures, one pointing directly at his construction site. They'd found him. Marcus backed away from the edge, his mind racing. 3 months. He'd managed 3 months of blessed anonymity in these mountains, 3 months of believing that Dr. Elizabeth Chen's death might have satisfied whoever was hunting the Meridian Tower secrets. The helicopter's appearance shattered that illusion like glass. He grabbed his tablet and quickly scrolled through the encrypted files he'd hidden in the structural analysis software. The real blueprints were still there. The ones that showed the Meridian Tower hadn't failed because of his calculations. Someone had deliberately weakened the support columns, and Elizabeth had discovered it first. Her frantic call the night she died echoed in his memory. Marcus, the metallurgy reports were falsified. The steel composition, the helicopter's engine grew louder. Marcus shoved the tablet into his backpack and began dismantling his equipment with desperate efficiency. His platform swayed as he worked, the cliff face offering no forgiveness for hasty movements. Below, the helicopter had landed in the small clearing where he'd parked his truck. 2 men emerged, both wearing dark suits utterly inappropriate for mountain terrain. Even from 300 feet up, Marcus could see they moved with military precision. One spoke into a radio while scanning the cliff face through binoculars. The other opened a metallic case and began assembling what looked disturbingly like a rifle. Marcus's fingers fumbled with the climbing gear. He'd planned an escape route, multiple routes actually, but always imagined he'd have more warning. The nearest alternate path down the cliff required rappelling across a 100-foot gap to reach a ledge system on the mountain's eastern face. In optimal conditions, it was dangerous. With armed men below, it felt suicidal. A sharp crack echoed off the rock walls. A bullet fragment ricocheted inches from his head, leaving a white scar on the granite. They weren't here to negotiate. He clipped into his rappelling system and grabbed the emergency pack he'd kept ready for exactly this scenario. Everything else, months of work, specialized equipment worth thousands, would have to stay. His masterpiece, the impossible house that was finally taking shape, would remain unfinished. Another shot rang out as Marcus swung away from the platform. The bullet sparked off his abandoned welding tank, and he prayed it wouldn't ignite. He descended rapidly, perhaps recklessly, trusting his equipment and experience to compensate for speed. The cliff face blurred past, familiar handholds, carefully plotted anchor points, the mathematical beauty of rock formations he'd come to know intimately. Each foot of descent carried him farther from his pursuers, but closer to the treacherous traverse that would either save him or kill him. At the jump-off point, Marcus paused to catch his breath and assess the gap. 100 feet of empty air stretched between his current position and the eastern ledge system. His rope wouldn't span the full distance. He'd need to build momentum and swing across, trusting physics and prayer to carry him safely. Below, he could hear shouting. One of the men was attempting to climb, though his city shoes and business attire made progress comically slow. The other continued shooting, but the angle and distance made accurate targeting nearly impossible. Marcus checked his gear one final time. The encrypted files were secure in his waterproof pack, along with enough supplies to reach the emergency cache he'd hidden on the mountain's far side. If he could make this crossing, if he could disappear into the wilderness he'd mapped so carefully, he might survive long enough to expose the truth about Meridian Tower. He thought of Elizabeth Chen, brilliant and principled, dead because she'd trusted the wrong person with her discoveries. He thought of the 43 people who died in the collapse, their families still believing Marcus Cole was responsible for shoddy engineering. He thought of the Shadow Corporation that had orchestrated it all, powerful enough to falsify government reports and eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The helicopter's engines spun up again. They were repositioning for a better angle. Marcus took 3 deep breaths, calculating trajectory and timing with the precision that had once made him one of the most sought-after structural engineers in the country. Physics didn't lie, even when everything else did. He stepped backward, building tension in the rope, then launched himself into the void. For a heart-stopping moment he was flying, suspended between stone and sky, carried by momentum and mathematics toward an uncertain salvation. The wind howled around him like the mountain's judgment, neither condemning nor absolving, simply waiting to see if he was worthy of survival. The blueprint tube felt heavier than it should have as Marcus descended the mountain path, the weight of Elena's warning echoing in his mind. Trust no one. The words cut deeper because they came from someone who had just saved his life, someone whose eyes held secrets as dark as his own. The cabin came into view through the pine trees, its weathered logs a stark contrast to the steel and glass structures he'd once designed. But even this humble retreat couldn't erase the image burned into his memory, the Meridian Tower folding like a house of cards, taking 17 lives with it. What the world didn't know was that the collapse hadn't been his miscalculation. It had been sabotage, hidden in the very blueprints that now rested against his shoulder. Marcus paused at his front door, scanning the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, but paranoia had become his constant companion since Seattle. He'd learned to read the subtle signs, a pebble displaced from where he'd left it, the angle of his mailbox shifted by degrees. Today, everything appeared untouched. Inside, he spread the Cliff House blueprints across his kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs. The design was ambitious to the point of madness. a cantilevered structure jutting from the cliff face like a glass and steel bird frozen mid-flight. But it was the structural calculations that made his pulse quicken. Hidden within the standard, load-bearing formulas were sequences that matched the ones he'd found in the Meridian Tower plans. Someone had embedded a secondary blueprint within the primary design, not for construction but for destruction. Marcus pulled out his laptop and began cross-referencing the mathematical sequences. The patterns were elegant in their subtlety. Stress points calculated not to bear maximum load, but to fail catastrophically under specific conditions. It was engineering genius perverted into something monstrous. A knock at the door froze his fingers over the keyboard. 3 measured raps, too deliberate to be casual. Marcus quietly closed the laptop and rolled up the blueprints, sliding them into the tube. The knock came again, more insistent. "Marcus Chen?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "I'm Detective Ray Morrison, Denver PD. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Through the peephole, Marcus saw a tall man in his 50s, graying hair and tired eyes, badge visible on his belt. Alone, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. Marcus opened the door but kept the chain latched. "What can I help you with, Detective? May I come in?" "It's regarding Dr. Elena Vasquez." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. "What about her?" Morrison's expression grew grave. "She's missing. Her research station was ransacked, equipment destroyed, there was blood." Marcus's hand tightened on the door frame. Elena had saved his life yesterday, and now she was gone. The timing couldn't be coincidental. When? "Sometime last night. A colleague found the scene this morning when she didn't report in." Morrison's eyes searched Marcus's face. "Her vehicle's GPS shows she was in this area yesterday. You wouldn't happen to have seen her, would you?" Every instinct screamed at Marcus to lie, but Elena's disappearance changed everything. "She helped me when I got caught in an avalanche yesterday afternoon. But she seemed fine when we parted ways. Mind if I come in? This mountain air's thin for us flatlanders." Marcus hesitated, then unlatched the chain. Morrison stepped inside, his eyes immediately cataloguing the sparse furnishings, the laptop, the coffee mugs on the table that clearly outlined where papers had been. "Nice place," Morrison said, though his tone suggested anything but casual interest. "Quiet. Good place to think." That was the idea. About the Meridian Tower collapse? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral. "That's behind me." "Is it?" Morrison moved closer to the table, his fingers trailing along the edge where the blueprint corners had rested. "Funny thing about Dr. Vasquez's research station. Someone was looking for something specific, tore the place apart but left expensive equipment untouched, almost like they were after documents, maybe blueprints." Marcus's throat went dry. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Morrison nodded slowly, then pulled out his phone. "Mind if I show you something?" The screen displayed a photograph of tire tracks in snow. These were found near Elena's station. "Interesting tread pattern. Matches the ones outside your cabin." The trap was closing, but Marcus couldn't tell if Morrison was hunter or prey. "I drove past her station on my way home yesterday. That's not a crime." "No, it's not." Morrison pocketed his phone, but lying to a police officer during a missing person investigation might complicate things, especially for someone already under federal scrutiny. The words hit like ice water. Morrison knew about the FBI investigation into the Meridian collapse, which meant this wasn't a random inquiry. Someone had connected Elena's disappearance to Marcus, and the blueprint tube suddenly felt like a target painted on his back. Morrison headed for the door, then paused. "Mr. Chen? Elena Vasquez is a good person. If someone has her because of something you're involved in, I hope you'll do the right thing." After the detective left, Marcus stood alone in his cabin, holding the blueprints that might have cost Elena her life. The morning mist clung to the cliff face like a shroud as Marcus examined the foundation work through his binoculars. 3 days had passed since the intruder's visit, and every shadow seemed to harbor threats. He'd moved his sleeping bag to different locations each night, never staying in the same spot twice. The concrete had cured beautifully. The specialized anchoring system he'd designed was holding better than he'd dared hope, even after yesterday's wind gusts that had rattled his temporary shelter like a tin can. But as he lowered the binoculars, movement in the valley below caught his attention. Two figures in hiking gear were making their way up the narrow trail that led to his construction site. They moved with purpose, not like casual hikers admiring the scenery. Marcus's pulse quickened as he recognized the deliberate pace of professionals. He gathered his tools quickly, stuffing them into a canvas bag. The Hartwell blueprints were safely hidden in a waterproof container, buried beneath a cairn of rocks 50 yards from the cliff edge. He'd memorized every detail of those plans, especially the modifications that had been made without his knowledge, the subtle alterations to the steel specifications that had turned his masterpiece into a death trap. The hikers would reach his position within 20 minutes. Marcus clipped his safety harness to the permanent anchor line he'd installed and began rappelling down the cliff face to where his real work was taking place. The public construction site above was just for show now. His actual progress was happening in plain sight, yet invisible to anyone who didn't understand what they were looking at. Suspended against the vertical rock wall, Marcus continued installing the revolutionary mounting system he'd developed. Traditional construction wisdom said building on a cliff face was impossible because of wind shear and thermal expansion. But Marcus had studied how mountain climbers secured themselves to seemingly impossible overhangs, how ice climbers trusted their lives to frozen waterfalls, how nature itself had carved these cliffs and yet left them standing for millennia. The secret was working with the mountain rather than fighting it. His design used a network of deep-bore anchors that created a flexible web of support points. Instead of one massive foundation that could fail catastrophically, he was creating dozens of smaller connection points that could shift and adjust with the mountain's natural movement. It was like building a spider web in 3 dimensions. Above him, voices carried on the wind. The hikers had reached his camp. "Nobody here," a woman's voice called out. "Professional, clipped, but the equipment's warm. He can't be far." Marcus pressed himself closer to the rock face, grateful for the grey climbing gear that helped him blend with the stone. Through a gap in the granite, he could see them examining his decoy workspace. The woman was tall, athletic, with the kind of situational awareness that screamed federal agent. Her companion was older, heavy-set, wearing expensive hiking boots that had never seen real trail time. The plans weren't in his apartment, the man was saying, nor his storage unit. He must have them here. "Assuming he still has them," the woman replied. "Maybe he destroyed them after Chicago." Chicago. Marcus's blood ran cold. They weren't just talking about the Hartwell building collapse. There had been another incident, one that hadn't made the national news. A parking garage in Chicago that had failed during construction, killing 2 workers. Marcus had consulted on that project years earlier, providing preliminary stress calculations that had later been modified by other engineers. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone was systematically eliminating engineers who had worked on specific projects, and they were using his stolen blueprints to identify the targets. But why? What connected these seemingly random construction failures? "Spread out," the woman ordered. "Check every inch. If he's here, we find him. If the plans are here, we find them." Marcus waited until they moved apart before beginning his ascent back to the top of the cliff. He needed to reach his hidden cache and disappear deeper into the mountains. But as he climbed, his engineer's mind was working through the problem like a complex structural analysis. 3 building failures, 3 different cities, 3 different engineering firms, but all connected to projects where Marcus had provided initial calculations that were later modified. Someone was using his original work as a template, then altering the final construction specifications to create deliberate weak points. The Hartwell building hadn't been a mistake, it had been sabotage. And now the saboteurs were cleaning up loose ends, eliminating anyone who might have noticed the discrepancies between original plans and final specifications. anyone who might have kept copies of the unaltered blueprints. Marcus hauled himself over the cliff edge just as the woman's voice carried across the rocky outcrop. "Found something! Fresh rope marks on these anchors!" He sprinted toward his cache, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind him, pursuit erupted as his movement caught their attention. The game of cat and mouse was over. Now it was simply a race for survival in terrain where one wrong step meant death. The storm hit 3 hours before dawn, turning the cliff face into a vertical river of ice and fury. Marcus pressed himself against the rock wall, his headlamp cutting through the chaos as wind-driven sleet hammered his exposed skin. The platform he'd built just days ago groaned under the assault, its steel framework singing an ominous tune that spoke of stress fractures and imminent failure. He should have been in his tent, waiting it out. Instead, he was clipped to a safety line, fighting to secure the foundation anchors before the storm could tear away 3 weeks of work. Every gust threatened to rip him from the cliff, but he'd learned to read the mountain's moods, to anticipate its violent rhythms. The blueprint tube was sealed inside his jacket, pressed against his ribs like a talisman. Even here, balanced between earth and sky, he couldn't escape its weight. The modified structural calculations that had killed 17 people weren't just evidence of corporate negligence. They were a template, a blueprint for catastrophic failure that could be replicated anywhere, anytime someone needed a building to fall at precisely the right moment. A particularly vicious gust slammed him sideways, and his safety line snapped taut. The anchor bolt above held, but metal shrieked against metal as the platform shifted 6 inches toward the abyss. Marcus forced himself to breathe, to calculate. The wind was approaching 90 miles per hour, well beyond what his temporary structures could handle. He had minutes, maybe less, before the mountain claimed everything he'd built. His radio crackled with static. Through the interference, Sarah's voice fought to reach him. "Marcus, the road's washed out below. You need to—" The transmission dissolved into white noise. Cut off. Just as he'd been when the Meridian Tower fell, when his phone calls to the safety inspector went unanswered, when his emails about the altered plans disappeared into corporate firewalls. But this time, isolation might save his life instead of destroying it. The platform lurched again, and Marcus heard the distinctive pop of a tension cable snapping. He had to choose, save the work or save himself. 3 weeks of 18-hour days hung in the balance, the foundation of his impossible dream cracking under nature's assault. But dreams could be rebuilt. The truth he carried couldn't be resurrected if he died with it. He began the retreat, moving hand over hand along the guide rope as sections of his platform peeled away into the darkness below. Each lost piece felt like a small death, another surrender to forces beyond his control. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd built towers that scraped the sky was being humbled by a mountain that had stood for millennia. Halfway to his tent, the headlamp died. The darkness was absolute, a black void that swallowed sound and direction. Marcus froze, his gloved hands locked on the rope, feeling the mountain's pulse through the stone. This was how it ended for climbers who pushed too hard, too fast, not in a blaze of heroic glory, but in confused exhaustion as the mountain simply absorbed them. But he wasn't a climber. He was an engineer, and engineers solved problems with their minds, not just their muscles. The guide rope led to safety if he could follow it without panic. 12 feet to the anchor point, then a right turn toward the tent platform. Count the steps, feel for the markers he'd placed by touch. The wind began to ease as he made the final approach to his shelter. Not much, but enough that he could hear his own breathing again, could think beyond the next handhold. The tent was intact, its guy lines holding against the storm's fury. He collapsed through the entrance, sealing himself into a bubble of relative calm while the mountain raged outside. In the tent's lead glow, he pulled out the blueprints with shaking hands. The waterproof case had held, the documents were dry despite the chaos outside. Page after page of technical specifications that looked innocuous to anyone without his expertise. But Marcus could read between the lines, could see where load calculations had been subtly modified, where safety margins had been quietly reduced. Someone had turned structural engineering into an assassination tool, and 17 people had paid the price for that innovation. The question that haunted him as the storm slowly passed was whether they'd known. Had the victims been random casualties of corporate greed, or had they been specifically targeted? Was the Meridian Tower's collapse an accident disguised as negligence, or something far more sinister? Dawn came grey and subdued, revealing the storm's damage in unforgiving detail. 2/3 of his platform was gone, along with most of his specialized equipment. The foundation anchors had held, but barely. Months of additional work stretched ahead, assuming he could even get new supplies up the mountain. Marcus stood at the edge of his remaining platform, looking out over a landscape scoured clean by wind and ice. The storm had taken almost everything, but it had also clarified something essential. He wasn't just building a house anymore, he was constructing a fortress, a place where the truth could survive, even if he didn't. The storm hit 3 hours before dawn, turning the cliff face into a waterfall of ice and debris. Marcus pressed himself against the rock wall inside his half-finished shelter, listening to the wind tear at the temporary supports he'd installed just yesterday. Every gust sent vibrations through the steel framework that made his teeth ache. He'd weathered storms before during the construction, but this one felt different, more violent, more personal, as if the mountain itself was trying to shake him loose like an unwanted parasite. Through the makeshift window opening, lightning illuminated the valley below in stark, black and white snapshots. The river had swollen to twice its normal width, and the access road he'd carved months ago was now a muddy scar, disappearing into churning water. Marcus checked his phone. No signal as expected. He was truly alone now, cut off from everything except the storm and his own racing thoughts. The isolation should have terrified him, but instead it brought an odd sense of clarity. Out here, with death a constant whisper in the wind, the complexities of his situation seemed to crystallize into something almost manageable. The Meridian Tower plans were still hidden in the sealed container he'd buried beneath the foundation stones. Elena's warning echoed in his mind. They know you have something. They won't stop looking. A sudden crack made him spin around. One of the support beams had shifted, its anchor point showing hairline fractures in the rock. Marcus grabbed his headlamp and inspection tools, crawling across the slick metal platform to examine the damage. The beam was holding barely, but the stress patterns were all wrong. In normal circumstances, he'd shore it up with additional supports and wait for better weather. But these weren't normal circumstances. If the beam failed completely, it would take half the platform with it, along with most of his progress over the past month. He couldn't afford to lose that much work, not when winter was approaching and his supplies were running low. Marcus rigged a temporary cable system, using the storm's own force to help tension the lines. It was dangerous work in the howling wind, each movement requiring absolute precision. One slip would send him tumbling into the abyss, but the familiar rhythm of problem-solving calmed his nerves. This was what he understood, the marriage of physics and intuition that had once made him brilliant. As he worked, his mind wandered to the encrypted files Elena had shown him. Meridian Tower wasn't the only building with compromised specifications. The conspiracy reached deeper than he'd imagined, involving dozens of structures across multiple cities. Someone had been systematically weakening buildings for years, creating a network of potential disasters. But why? Insurance fraud seemed too simple an answer. The scope was too vast, too coordinated. It felt more like preparation, as if someone was building the infrastructure for something much larger and more devastating. The wind shifted suddenly, driving rain horizontal across the cliff face. Marcus lost his grip on the cable tensioner, watching helplessly as it skittered across the platform toward the edge. Without thinking, he lunged after it, his boots finding purchase on the wet steel just as his fingers closed around the tool. For a moment he lay there, breathing hard, feeling the platform flex beneath him like a living thing. The adrenaline rush was familiar, the same cocktail of terror and exhilaration he'd felt in the early days of his career, when every project pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. That's when he heard it, the distant rumble of an engine, barely audible over the storm. Marcus crawled to the platform's edge and peered down through his binoculars. Far below, twin headlight beams cut through the rain, moving slowly along the flooded access road. The vehicle, it looked like a heavy-duty truck, was struggling through the mud but making steady progress toward the cliff base. His blood turned cold. No one would attempt that drive in weather like this unless they were absolutely determined to reach him. And given recent events, determination like that usually came with bad intentions. Marcus gathered his tools quickly, securing everything that couldn't afford to be lost. The platform still needed hours of work to be truly stable, but it would have to hold for now. He retreated to the deepest part of his shelter, where he'd installed emergency supplies and communications equipment. The satellite phone Elena had given him finally picked up a weak signal. He tried her number first, but got only static. The storm was interfering with everything electronic, turning his technological lifelines into expensive paperweights. Below, the headlights had stopped moving. Marcus could make out at least two figures emerging from the vehicle, their flashlight beams dancing across the cliff base as they searched for his climbing route. They'd found his anchor points within minutes. These weren't amateurs stumbling around in the dark. Marcus checked his pistol, making sure the ammunition was dry. He'd hoped it would never come to this, but hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. The storm that had threatened to destroy his shelter might now be his only protection, turning the mountain into a fortress that would test his pursuers as brutally as it had tested him. The rope snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and Marcus watched his tool bag plummet 300 feet into the valley below. He pressed himself against the cliff face, heart hammering as he listened to the distant crash of metal on stone. That was the second accident in 3 days. Someone was sabotaging his equipment. The wind whipped across the exposed granite, sending ice crystals stinging against his face. His fingers, already numb despite the work gloves, struggled to maintain their grip on the remaining anchor points. The platform he'd built 2 weeks ago swayed ominously beneath him, and he could see where someone had filed partway through one of the support cables. Not enough to make it obvious, just enough to ensure failure under stress. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, fighting the urge to rush back to solid ground. Panic killed climbers faster than falling rocks. He methodically checked each remaining anchor, finding 2 more that had been compromised. Whoever was doing this knew exactly how to make death look accidental. The question was whether they wanted the blueprints or simply wanted him dead before he could decode them further. 3 nights ago, working by lamplight in his half-finished shelter, Marcus had finally cracked another layer of the encryption hidden in the structural drawings. What he'd found made his blood run cold. The building that had collapsed wasn't just faulty, it had been deliberately weakened. Someone had paid the original architect, David Chen, to introduce specific stress failures that would manifest years later. But Chen had been smarter than his employers realized. He'd hidden a complete record of the conspiracy within the technical specifications, disguised as routine calculations, load-bearing requirements, that were actually bank account numbers, material density figures that decoded into names and dates, an entire murder plot masquerading as engineering data. The problem was that Chen was dead, killed in what police had ruled a climbing accident just months before the building collapse. And now Marcus was experiencing similar accidents on the same mountain where Chen's body had been found. He began the careful process of rappelling down to a more secure position, testing each anchor point twice before committing his weight to it. The wind had picked up, and snow was beginning to fall, large, wet flakes that would make the rock surface treacherous within minutes. Halfway down, he heard the sound of an engine echoing off the valley walls. Marcus paused, hanging 30 feet below his compromised platform, and peered through the increasing snowfall. A black SUV was winding up the narrow mountain road toward his base camp. No one knew he was here except Sarah, and she drove a beat-up Toyota. He changed direction, swinging toward a narrow ledge that would put him out of sight from above. His arms burned from the exertion, and his hands were losing feeling rapidly. The temperature was dropping fast, and he was dressed for construction work, not a winter survival situation. The engine sound grew closer, then stopped. Car doors slammed and voices carried on the wind. At least 2 people, maybe 3. Marcus couldn't make out words, but the tone was businesslike and urgent. He worked his way along the ledge toward a chimney formation he'd identified during his initial survey. It would provide shelter and a hidden route to higher ground. As he moved, pieces of the puzzle continued falling into place in his mind. The building collapse had killed 17 people, but it had also eliminated a key witness in a federal corruption investigation. Judge Helena Morrison had been reviewing evidence of massive kickbacks in city construction contracts when the conference room floor gave way beneath her. Her death had effectively ended the investigation, saving dozens of powerful people from exposure. Chen had designed the building's failure to look random, but he'd kept insurance, detailed records of who had paid him, how much, and exactly what they'd purchased with their money. The blueprints weren't just evidence of criminal negligence, they were a roadmap to the largest municipal corruption scandal in the state's history. And Marcus had been the perfect fall guy, a structural engineer with a reputation for cutting corners, already under investigation for unrelated safety violations. When the building collapsed, all eyes had turned to him while the real conspirators melted back into their legitimate lives. The voices were getting closer now, and he could hear equipment being unloaded from the vehicle. Professional climbing gear from the sound of it. These weren't random hikers who'd stumbled onto his camp. Marcus reached the chimney and began working his way upward, using his back and feet to brace against opposite walls. The technique required steady pressure and careful movement, but it would take him above the tree line where he could see his pursuers without being spotted. Snow continued to fall, and the light was fading fast. In 2 hours it would be full dark, and the temperature would drop below 0. He was caught between killers below and a mountain that showed no mercy to the unprepared. But he'd survived worse odds before, and now he finally understood what David Chen had died trying to expose. The wind had picked up overnight, howling through the canyon like a living thing. Marcus pressed himself against the cliff face, his safety harness straining as another gust threatened to tear him from the rock. The platform he'd built 3 days ago creaked ominously below, but it held. Everything depended on it holding. He'd been working since dawn, drilling anchor points for the next phase of construction. Each hole had to be perfect, the granite was unforgiving, and one miscalculation would send tons of steel tumbling into the abyss. His hands were raw despite the gloves, and exhaustion clouded his vision, but he couldn't stop, not when he was this close. The encrypted files Marcus had found buried in the Meridian Tower blueprints revealed more than just structural weaknesses. Hidden within the load calculations and stress analyses was a secondary set of plans, blueprints for something that had nothing to do with office space. The building's basement levels extended far deeper than publicly documented, creating a vast underground facility, the kind of space that could house servers, laboratories, or worse. Someone had turned a 40-story office building into a front for clandestine operations, and when Marcus had stumbled onto it during his investigation, they'd made sure the building came down. His reputation was just collateral damage. He rappelled down to the main platform, landing silently on the reinforced steel decking. The structure jutted out from the cliff like a defiant fist, supported by a network of cables and anchor points that had taken him weeks to install. His temporary shelter sat at the back, a weatherproof pod that served as both workshop and living space. The scraping grew louder. Whoever was climbing was good, too good to be a casual hiker who'd wandered off trail. Marcus grabbed the binoculars from his gear bag and peered over the edge. 3 figures in tactical gear were ascending the cliff face with professional efficiency. They moved in leapfrog formation, covering each other as they climbed. Military or private contractors. Either way, they weren't here for a friendly chat. Marcus's pulse spiked. He'd chosen this location specifically because it was inaccessible, assuming his isolation would be protection enough. He'd been wrong. Moving quickly but quietly, He gathered the most critical items from his shelter: the tablet containing the encrypted files, backup drives, and his pistol. Everything else would have to stay. He stuffed the gear into a waterproof pack and clipped it to his harness. The climbers were maybe 200 feet below now. At their current pace, they'd reach his platform in 10 minutes. Marcus looked up at the cliff face above. He'd scouted those routes weeks ago but never climbed them. The rock was looser up there, more dangerous. But dangerous was relative when the alternative was a bullet. He was clipping into the safety line when voices drifted up from below. Targets on the platform. No visual on the subject. Copy that. Phoenix wants this clean. Make it look like an accident. Phoenix. The name sent ice through Marcus's veins. He'd heard it mentioned in phone calls at the Meridian Project, always in hushed tones. Whatever Phoenix was, it had enough reach to orchestrate a building collapse and enough resources to send killers after him in the middle of nowhere. Marcus started climbing. The granite was solid for the first 30 feet, offering good handholds and purchase for his boots. Then the rock quality changed. Loose shale and crumbling ledges made every move a gamble. One piece of gear popped free under his weight, sending debris rattling down toward the platform below. Movement above. He's climbing. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off the rock face. Marcus pressed himself into a shallow depression, feeling granite chips pepper his helmet. They were shooting blind, but at this range, they didn't need precision, just luck. He forced himself to keep climbing. Each move was calculated terror, finding purchase on holds that might crumble at any moment. His breathing was ragged, lungs burning in the thin air. The pack on his back felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Another volley of shots echoed through the canyon. Marcus looked down to see the climbers had reached his platform and were setting up for a better angle. He had maybe 60 seconds before they could establish clean sight lines. The cliff face above curved inward, creating an overhang. Marcus had avoided it before because it looked unstable, but now it might be his salvation. If he could reach it, the angle would protect him from the shooters below. 40 feet to go. His left hand found a solid hold just as his right foot slipped. For a heart-stopping moment, he hung by one arm, legs scrambling for purchase. Then his boot caught a narrow ledge, and he pressed upward again. 20 feet. The overhang loomed above him like a stone roof. Behind him, the gunfire had stopped. They were moving, repositioning for a better shot. Marcus reached up into the darkness above, searching blindly for handholds he couldn't see. His fingers found a crack in the rock, and he pulled himself into the shadow of the overhang just as the shooting resumed. For the moment, he was safe. But trapped between bullets and a crumbling cliff, safety was just another word for a slower death. The wind howled through the canyon as Marcus pressed himself against the cliff face, the metal briefcase containing the original blueprints cutting into his ribs. 300 feet below, Detective Chen's flashlight beam swept back and forth across the rocks where his body should have been. He'd made the jump just as the ledge collapsed, fingers finding purchase on a narrow outcrop he'd spotted during his construction work. The briefcase had nearly dragged him down, but the secrets inside were worth more than his life, and apparently worth killing for. His satellite phone buzzed against his chest. Sarah's number. Thank God! Her voice crackled through the static. I heard the explosion from town. Are you? They think I'm dead, Marcus whispered, pulling himself into a shallow cave he'd discovered weeks earlier. How long until you reach the extraction point? 20 minutes. But Marcus, there's something else. I decoded more of the files you sent. The Meridian Tower wasn't the only building. There are 12 others across 6 countries, all with the same hidden structural modifications. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. All of them compromised? Worse, they're designed to fail on command. Remote detonation points built into the support columns, disguised as standard reinforcement. Someone's been planning this for years. The implications hit him like a physical blow. 12 buildings, thousands of lives. The Meridian Tower collapse hadn't been about covering up shoddy construction. It had been a field test. Below, Chen's voice echoed off the canyon walls as she coordinated with her team. Marcus could make out fragments, no body found yet, and keep searching until dawn. He needed to move before they brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. The cave tunnel led deeper into the cliff face, part of an old mining operation that predated his geological surveys. He'd explored it briefly while planning his house's foundation, never imagining he'd need it as an escape route. His phone buzzed again. This time, an unknown number. "You should have died in that explosion." The voice was electronically distorted, impossible to identify. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been watching you build your little monument to failure. Did you really think hiding in the mountains would keep you safe?" Marcus's grip tightened on the briefcase. "The Meridian Tower, you killed those people. 16 deaths, regrettable but necessary to field test the system. The next phase will be considerably larger in scope. I'll stop you." A mechanical laugh. "You're a disgraced engineer hiding in a cave. You'll stop nothing, but since you've seen too much, we're upgrading your status from useful scapegoat to active threat." The line went dead. Marcus forced himself to breathe. The tunnel ahead split into 3 branches. His construction work had taught him the mountain's layout, but these passages were unmapped territory. He chose the middle route, following a slight upward slope that might lead to another exit. The briefcase scraped against the tunnel walls as he crawled through increasingly narrow spaces. Inside lay the complete architectural plans for Project Constellation, 12 buildings designed to house government offices, corporate headquarters, and international organizations. Each one a potential weapon. His phone vibrated with a text from Sarah, helicopter circling, taking alternate route. Then another message, this one from Chen. "I know you're alive. The explosion was too convenient. Call me." Marcus stared at the screen. Chen had been investigating the Meridian Tower collapse for months. She might be the only law enforcement officer who suspected the truth. But trusting her meant exposing Sarah to danger. A distant rumbling echoed through the tunnels, not machinery, helicopters, multiple aircraft converging on the area. He pushed deeper into the mountain, following the tunnel as it curved sharply upward. The air grew thinner, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Somewhere ahead lay freedom, if he could reach it before his pursuers mapped every escape route. The briefcase snagged on a rock outcropping. As he worked it free, the latches popped open, scattering papers across the tunnel floor. By the light of his phone, he saw what Sarah had missed in her digital analysis. Handwritten notes in the margins, coordinates for something called Phase 3. The locations made his stomach drop. Sydney Opera House, Pentagon, UN headquarters in New York. This wasn't about money or corporate sabotage. Someone was planning to hold the world's most iconic buildings hostage, turning architectural marvels into weapons of mass destruction. His phone showed 17 missed calls from Sarah and 3 from Chen. But there was another number he needed to call first, one he'd memorized but hoped never to use. The tunnel finally opened onto a snow-covered ledge high on the mountain's north face. Below, searchlights swept through the darkness like deadly fireflies. Above, helicopters circled in tightening patterns. Marcus pulled out his satellite phone and dialed the emergency number for the FBI's counterterrorism division. "This is Marcus Webb. I'm calling to report an imminent terrorist attack on multiple international targets." The hunt for him was just beginning, but now he was hunting too. The wind had died to an unnatural stillness when Marcus heard the helicopter approaching from the south. He'd been expecting this. The radio silence from Elena for 12 hours had told him everything he needed to know. They'd found her. He stood at the edge of his impossible construction, 400 feet above the valley floor, watching the black speck grow larger against the morning sky. The cliff house was nearly complete now, its cantilevered sections jutting out from the rock face like a steel and glass defiance of gravity. Everything he'd learned from the Hartwell blueprints had gone into this structure, every stolen innovation and blood-soaked calculation. The helicopter circled once, its downdraft making the suspension cables sing. Marcus could see figures inside, and he knew Donovan would be among them. The man who'd killed Hartwell, who'd tried to bury the revolutionary engineering techniques along with their creator, who'd orchestrated the Singapore collapse to hide the evidence of corporate theft. Like the Meridian Tower? Marcus stepped back from the edge, moving toward the interior of his creation. The main support beam, a hollow titanium alloy shaft that ran through the heart of the structure, gleamed in the filtered sunlight. Funny thing about that collapse, I've had time to run the calculations again. Ancient history, Reeves. You're done running. Marcus smiled grimly. The weight distribution was perfect, the foundation was solid. But someone switched the steel specifications 3 days before completion. Cheaper grade, same appearance. The building was murdered, Donovan, just like Hartwell. The helicopter was descending now, looking for a place to land on the narrow plateau where Marcus had staged his construction materials. Through the glass walls of his cliff house, he could see rappelling gear being prepared. Elena gave you up, you know, Donovan continued. Told us everything about your little conspiracy theories. She's safe, by the way, for now. The lie came too easily. Elena Chen, the investigative journalist who'd helped him piece together the connections between Hartwell's death and the stolen patents, wouldn't have broken, which meant she was dead. Marcus moved through his creation with practiced efficiency, activating systems he'd spent months installing. Hidden throughout the structure were shaped charges, not enough to destroy it, but carefully placed to sever specific connection points. If he couldn't expose the truth, he'd at least deny them the prize. The thing is, Donovan, I know what you really want. It's not me, it's this. Marcus ran his hand along the central support beam. Hartwell's cantilever dynamics, scaled up and perfected, a building technique that could revolutionize construction in seismic zones. Worth billions. You've proven the concept works. That's all we needed. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus watched armed figures rappelling down the cliff face. They moved with military precision, black-clad spiders descending toward his web of steel and glass. He had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached him. He opened a reinforced cabinet and withdrew a tablet connected to the house's structural monitoring system. Every stress point, every load calculation, every micro-adjustment the building made to compensate for wind and thermal expansion, it was all recorded here. The complete blueprint of Hartwell's vision, perfected through months of trial and error. I've been thinking about Singapore, Marcus said into the phone as he uploaded the data to a dozen servers scattered across the globe. About all those people who died because of your greed. Their families deserved better than the lie you fed them. Noble words from a man standing in a metal coffin 400 feet in the air. The first commando had reached the main platform. Marcus could see him testing the glass walls, looking for entry points. The man would find them. Marcus had no intention of making this a siege. You know what I learned building this place? Marcus walked to the central control panel, his fingers hovering over a series of switches. Hartwell wasn't just a genius, he was an artist. This technique doesn't just make buildings stronger, it makes them alive, responsive, adaptive. Enough poetry, step outside, and we'll make this quick. Marcus flipped the first switch. Throughout the structure, electromagnetic locks disengaged with soft clicks. The commandos would find their entry now, but they'd also find something else. The building began to shift almost imperceptibly, its carefully calibrated joints adjusting to redistribute the load as sections of the platform supporting their helicopter suddenly became unstable. The beautiful thing about adaptive engineering, Marcus said, watching through the monitors as the assault team realized their landing zone was collapsing, is that it responds to threats. The helicopter pulled away from the plateau just as the temporary landing pad, never meant to support that much weight, crumbled into the void. Marcus smiled and flipped the second switch. The wind howled through the canyon as Marcus pressed himself against the rock face, his fingers numb from gripping the emergency rope. Below him, the twisted remains of his winch system dangled uselessly, severed cables whipping in the gusts. Above, the half-finished structure groaned ominously. its exposed framework straining against forces it wasn't yet designed to withstand. He'd been sabotaged. The cuts in the cables were too clean, too precise to be accidental wear. Someone had climbed up here in the darkness and systematically weakened his lifeline to the valley below. The realization sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the altitude. Marcus hauled himself up hand over hand, his shoulders screaming in protest. Each movement was agony, but stopping meant death. The emergency rope was thin, meant only for short-distance safety work, not a full ascent of the cliff face. He could feel it stretching under his weight. 20 feet, 15. His vision blurred from exhaustion, but he forced himself to focus on the next handhold, then the next. When his fingers finally closed around the edge of his work platform, he nearly sobbed with relief. Rolling onto the wooden planking, Marcus lay gasping for several minutes before the cold forced him to move. He crawled toward the supply shed he'd built into the cliff face, his sanctuary and workshop. Inside, he collapsed onto a chair and surveyed his situation with growing dread. No winch, no radio. He'd left it in the truck at the bottom. No way down except the sheer drop that had nearly killed him. And somewhere out there, someone who wanted him dead badly enough to climb 1,000 feet of treacherous rock in the dark. Marcus pulled the crumpled blueprints from their hiding place behind a false panel. The Meridian Tower plans looked innocent enough in the lamplight, but he traced the familiar lines with his finger, seeing again what had taken him months to recognize. The structural defect hadn't been his miscalculation. It had been deliberately engineered into the design from the beginning. Someone had wanted that building to fall. The question was who, and why they needed him silenced now. A scraping sound outside made him freeze. Slow, deliberate movement on the rocks. Marcus extinguished his lamp and grabbed the heavy wrench from his toolbox, his heart hammering. The sounds grew closer, definitely footsteps, careful but confident. Whoever was coming knew how to move on the cliff face. The door burst inward without warning. Marcus swung the wrench in a vicious arc, but his attacker was ready, catching his wrist in an iron grip. In the darkness, he caught a glimpse of tactical gear and night vision goggles before a fist connected with his solar plexus, dropping him to his knees. Marcus Chen. The voice was professionally calm, almost conversational. "You've been a very difficult man to find." Marcus gasped for air, trying to make out his attacker's face in the dim moonlight filtering through the doorway. Who are you?" "Someone who's been cleaning up a very old mess." The figure moved to the lamp and struck a match, illuminating angular features and cold grey eyes. "My name is Kellerman. I work for the people who built the Meridian Tower, North Point Construction, among others." Kellerman's smile was predatory. "You discovered something you shouldn't have, something that died with the tower, or should have." Marcus forced himself to his feet, still clutching his ribs. The structural failure was intentional, but why? Why murder 43 innocent people? Insurance, urban renewal, political pressure, take your pick. Kellerman shrugged. The building was hemorrhaging money, sitting in the way of $1 billion development project. Sometimes demolition by catastrophe is more cost-effective than demolition by permit. The casual admission of mass murder hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You're insane." "I'm practical. And now I'm finishing the job that should have been done 2 years ago." Kellerman reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol. "Nothing personal, Chen. You're just a loose thread." Marcus's mind raced. The blueprints were still on the table between them, but Kellerman hadn't seemed to notice them yet. If he could create a distraction, maybe grab them and get outside. "Looking for these?" Kellerman had followed his gaze. "Don't worry. They'll burn with everything else. Gas leak explosion. Very tragic. The hermit engineer, driven mad by guilt, destroys his impossible dream house and himself with it." "The structure will survive," Marcus said desperately. "The framework's anchored directly into the cliff face. It'll take more than a gas explosion." "Will it?" Kellerman smiled again. "I brought some friends. Military-grade thermite charges already in place. This whole section of cliff face is coming down, Chen, along with any evidence you might have hidden up here." Outside, Marcus could hear more movement, at least two other figures positioning themselves around the platform. He was trapped, outnumbered, and running out of time. But as Kellerman raised the pistol, Marcus noticed something the killer had missed. Behind him, barely visible in the lamplight, a thin crack ran across the wooden floor where the thermite charge's weight had stressed the emergency support beam. The beam Marcus had deliberately engineered to fail under excessive load. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cliff face as Marcus worked to secure the final support beam, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the exhaustion weighing on every muscle. 3 days had passed since Sarah's warning about Harrison's men closing in, and he could feel time running out like sand through his fingers. Every sound from the valley below made him freeze, listening for the rumble of engines or the crack of boots on stone. The house was nearly complete, a testament to engineering that defied every conventional wisdom about mountain construction. But it was more than that now. It had become his fortress, his last stand against the forces that had been hunting him since the Meridian Tower collapse. The blueprints that had destroyed his life were now the key to his survival. Sarah emerged from the interior, her face pale with urgency. "Marcus, we have a problem. I've been monitoring the radio frequencies, and there's chatter about a team moving up the eastern ridge. They'll be here by nightfall." He didn't stop working, couldn't afford to. "How many?" "At least 6, possibly more. Professional-grade equipment, from what I can tell." She moved to help him lift a reinforcement strut into place. "They're not just here to retrieve those blueprints anymore. Harrison wants us gone permanently." The weight of her words settled over him like the mountain mist. He'd known this moment would come, had been preparing for it in ways Sarah didn't fully understand. The house wasn't just his redemption. It was designed to be impregnable, every angle calculated for defense as much as stability. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, securing the final bolt with mechanical precision, "about what those blueprints really contain." Sarah's hands stilled on the support beam. "What do you mean?" Marcus straightened, his gaze fixed on the horizon where storm clouds were gathering like harbingers of the coming confrontation. The flaw in the Meridian Tower wasn't an accident. It was engineered, built into the design from the beginning. Someone wanted that building to fail, but they needed it to happen after a specific event, after the International Banking Summit that was supposed to be held on the 42nd floor. The implications hit her like a physical blow. "You're talking about assassination, mass murder." "Exactly. But the summit was moved at the last minute due to security concerns. The building fell with only maintenance staff inside, but it was supposed to take out 12 world finance ministers and 200 other attendees." His voice carried the weight of months of terrible understanding. "I was set up to be the fall guy, the disgraced engineer whose mistake caused a tragic accident. No one would look deeper." Sarah stared at him, pieces clicking into place. "That's why they want the blueprints back so badly. Evidence of the deliberate sabotage." "More than that. The same engineering firm that designed the Meridian Tower has contracts for major infrastructure projects across 3 continents. Bridges, government buildings, airports, all potential targets using the same hidden flaws." Marcus moved to the edge of his creation, testing the stability of the outer rail with his full weight. "I've spent months analyzing every project, mapping the vulnerabilities. It's not just about stopping them. It's about exposing a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels." A distant rumble echoed up from the valley, the sound of heavy vehicles navigating the mountain roads. Sarah grabbed a pair of binoculars and scanned the tree line below. 3 black SUVs moving fast. "We're out of time." Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him, the same feeling he'd experienced in the moments before solving a particularly complex structural problem. All the variables were known now, all the forces calculated. Get inside and lock the blast shutters. The house is designed to withstand more than just wind and weather. What about you? "I have work to finish." He moved to a concealed panel near the main entrance, revealing a control system that looked more suited to a military installation than a mountain home. This whole structure is rigged with sensors, cameras, and a few surprises Harrison's men won't expect. Sometimes the best defense is making your enemy come to you on your terms. As Sarah disappeared into the fortified interior, Marcus activated the house's defensive systems. Hidden cameras emerged from camouflaged housings, motion sensors came online, and reinforced barriers slid into place across vulnerable access points. The cliff-face home transformed from an architectural marvel into something approaching a high-tech bunker. The first shots rang out just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, muzzle flashes sparking like deadly fireflies in the growing darkness. Marcus smiled grimly as he watched Harrison's team struggle to find purchase on the deliberately treacherous approach routes he'd designed. They might have superior numbers and firepower, but this was his mountain now, his creation. The real battle was about to begin, and for the first time since the Meridian Tower fell, Marcus Chen felt like he held the advantage. The helicopter's rotors cut through the thin mountain air like mechanical thunder, drowning out Marcus's shouts as he pressed himself against the cliff face. Below him, his impossible house clung to the rock wall, a testament to everything he'd learned about defying gravity and the men who'd tried to bury his discovery. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio clipped to his climbing harness. "They're landing on the plateau above you. 2 aircraft, at least 6 men. Marcus checked his gear one final time. The modified pitons he'd forged contained more than steel. Each one held a compressed data chip with copies of the Meridian blueprints and evidence of the cover-up. If he didn't make it out, the mountains themselves would hold the truth. "Remember," he said into the radio, "if this goes bad, the dead drop coordinates are in my desk. Contact Chen directly, not the FBI. Trust no one else." "You're not dying today, Marcus Kane." Sarah's voice carried the same determination that had brought her up this mountain to find him. "I didn't climb 3,000 feet to watch you become a martyr." The first repelling line dropped past his position. Marcus could hear boots scraping against stone somewhere above. They were coming down fast, too fast for safety, which meant they were desperate. He began his own descent, using the intricate pulley system he'd built into his house's support structure. Every beam, every cable had been designed with dual purpose. The same engineering that kept his home anchored to the cliff now became his escape route. A gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. Rock fragments exploded near his head, and Marcus realized they weren't planning to take him alive. Whatever Vincent Carrera had told these men, it had convinced them that silence was worth more than answers. Marcus swung sideways, using his momentum to crash through one of his own windows. Glass showered around him as he rolled into what had been his living room just hours before. Everything he'd built here, his sanctuary, his redemption project, would be destroyed before sunset. But that was acceptable. He'd never built this house to last forever. His hands found the concealed panel behind the fireplace, fingers working the combination lock he could open blindfolded. Inside waited his original briefcase, the same one he'd carried out of Harrison Engineering 18 months ago, now containing enough evidence to bring down a conspiracy that reached from local planning boards to federal oversight committees. Another window exploded inward. Black-clad figures were rappelling directly onto his deck now, their tactical gear making them look like mechanical spiders against the stone backdrop. Marcus triggered the emergency release he'd hoped never to use. Throughout the house, steel cables began retracting into their housings. The entire structure, designed to withstand earthquakes and 100-mile-per-hour winds, started folding in on itself like an enormous puzzle box. The tactical team's shouts turned to panic as the floor beneath them began tilting. Marcus had engineered this collapse with the same precision he'd once brought to construction. Every beam would fold exactly where intended, creating a controlled demolition that would look like structural failure to anyone who didn't understand his true blueprints. He burst through the rear exit as his kitchen collapsed behind him. The emergency zip line he'd installed for exactly this scenario stretched across the canyon to a rocky outcrop 800 feet away. It was designed for evacuation under extreme circumstances, though he'd never imagined those circumstances would involve professional killers. Marcus clipped in and jumped. The line sang under his weight as he rocketed across the void. Behind him, his impossible house continued its programmed destruction, taking 3 of Carrera's men with it into the canyon below. The remaining operatives could only watch from the cliff face as their target disappeared into the maze of rock formations on the far side. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Even with the evidence in his briefcase, proving the conspiracy would require him to survive long enough to present it, and Carrera had demonstrated he possessed resources that reached far beyond hired killers. The zip line deposited him on a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for his boots. From here, Sarah's voice guided him through the escape route they'd planned during the long night discussions about what they were really up against. "Motorcycle's where we left it, half a mile down the fire road," she said. "I'm tracking their helicopters on my scanner. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they can reposition for pursuit." Marcus began climbing down the concealed path he'd carved into the rock face over months of preparation. Every handhold had been tested, every route memorized. If his house had been an impossible feat of engineering, his escape plan was its logical extension, the work of a man who understood that sometimes the only way to build something lasting was to ensure it could be completely destroyed. The sound of rotor blades grew distant as he descended toward the tree line. Soon, Vincent Carrera would learn that some secrets were too dangerous to bury, and some engineers too stubborn to kill quietly. The explosion echoed through the canyon like thunder, sending a cascade of loose rock tumbling into the abyss below. Marcus pressed himself against the cliff face, his safety harness cutting into his ribs as debris rained down around him. The charges Victor had planted were meant to bring down the entire structure, but the house held, barely. "You can't run forever, Chen." Victor's voice carried on the wind from somewhere above. "The blueprints belong to us." Marcus tested his weight against the anchor point he'd just secured. The bolt held firm in the granite, one of dozens he'd drilled during months of meticulous preparation. Every escape route had been planned, every contingency mapped. He'd learned from his mistakes, the kind that had killed 17 people in Dallas and nearly destroyed him in the process. His fingers found the next handhold, muscle memory guiding him along the route he'd practiced in darkness. The house creaked ominously overhead, its revolutionary support system stressed beyond design limits, but still functioning, still proving his theories correct, even as someone tried to murder him for them. The USB drive burned against his chest, where he'd taped it beneath his shirt. 3 years of stolen data, hidden calculations, and evidence of the most audacious engineering fraud in construction history. Chen Industries hadn't just cut corners on the Dallas project. They'd deliberately used substandard materials while billing for military-grade specifications. And Marcus had the proof. A rifle shot cracked above him, the bullet sparking off granite inches from his head. Victor had found his position. "You were supposed to take the fall quietly," Victor called out, moving closer. "Play the disgraced engineer, disappear into obscurity, but you couldn't leave it alone." Marcus swung sideways, using momentum to reach a narrow ledge he'd carved specifically for this purpose. His hands shook as he clipped in a new anchor point, not from fear, but from exhaustion. 48 hours without sleep, subsisting on adrenaline and determination. "The families deserve to know the truth," Marcus shouted back, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "The families got their settlements. Everyone moved on, except you." Another shot, closer this time. Marcus could hear Victor rappelling down the cliff face above him, equipment jingling with each movement. Professional-grade gear. Military surplus, Marcus guessed. Chen Industries had deep pockets and deeper connections. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon and setting his house swaying. The structure groaned but held, its revolutionary tension cable system distributing stress exactly as he'd calculated. If he survived this, if he could get the evidence to Sarah Winters at the Tribune, the world would finally understand what he'd discovered in those original blueprints. Chen Industries hadn't just built one defective building, they'd been systematically substituting inferior materials across dozens of projects, pocketing the difference while creating death traps disguised as safe havens. Schools, hospitals, apartment complexes, all ticking time bombs waiting for the right stress conditions. Marcus reached for his radio, hoping to raise the sheriff's department, but Victor's voice cut through the static. "Signals jammed, Chen. Just like your little press conference yesterday. Did you really think we wouldn't find out about your meeting with that reporter?" The blood in Marcus's veins turned to ice water. "Sarah, if they'd discovered the meeting—" "We picked her up this morning," Victor continued, as if reading his thoughts. "Very cooperative once we explained the situation. Amazing how quickly journalists abandon their principles when their children's safety is discussed." Rage flooded through Marcus, burning away exhaustion and fear. He'd spent 3 years hiding, 3 years preparing, 3 years building not just a house but a fortress where he could finally make his stand. And now they were threatening innocence. His fingers found the detonator he'd hoped never to use. The house above him held 17 separate charges, each one carefully placed to bring down specific sections while preserving others. Not to destroy evidence, to create it. Every beam, every joint, every failure point had been documented and recorded. When the structure fell, it would fall in a pattern that told the true story of what had happened in Dallas. "You want the truth about those blueprints, Victor?" Marcus called out, his thumb hovering over the trigger. "Let me show you exactly how Chen Industries builds their death traps." The first charges detonated in sequence, severing the main support cables with surgical precision. The house shuddered, tilted, and began its carefully choreographed descent into the canyon. Each failure cascaded exactly as Marcus had calculated, the structure tearing itself apart in a demonstration of every corner Chen Industries had cut. Victor's scream of rage was lost in the roar of collapsing steel and concrete. Marcus pressed himself against the cliff face as his life's work thundered past him into the abyss below. Somewhere in that wreckage lay the physical proof of his theories, but the real evidence, the documents, the calculations, the smoking gun, remained safe against his chest. Now he just had to survive long enough to deliver it. The cliff top shuddered beneath Marcus's feet as another explosion echoed from the valley below. Through the pre-dawn darkness, orange flames licked at the skeletal remains of Hartwell's construction equipment, twisted metals scattered like broken bones across the mountainside. The fire would bring authorities soon, but not soon enough to matter. Sarah pressed the sat phone into his trembling hands. "FBI's 20 minutes out," she said, her voice steady despite the blood trickling from her temple. "But Hartwell's crew won't wait that long." Marcus stared at the device, then at the impossible structure cantilevered over the abyss behind them. His cliff house stood defiant against the mountain face, every beam and joint precisely calculated to embrace forces that should have torn it apart. Like the corrupted seismic data hidden in those Phoenix Tower blueprints, his home was proof that everything the world believed about limits could be wrong. "The drive's still in the foundation access," he said, watching flashlight beams bob through the trees below. "Without it, Hartwell walks away clean, and every building they've compromised becomes a ticking time bomb. Then we get it." Sarah checked her service weapon, counting remaining rounds with practiced efficiency. "But we do this smart." The first gunshot cracked through the mountain air as Hartwell's remaining mercenaries reached the clearing. Marcus dropped low, pulling Sarah behind the generator housing as bullets sparked off steel and shattered the workshop windows he'd spent months installing by hand. "You killed good men tonight, Reed," Hartwell's voice carried across the darkness from somewhere near the construction trailer. "For what? Data that proves nothing? Buildings fail every day." Marcus crawled toward the house's entrance, staying below the deck railing. 27 buildings, he called back, all designed using your modified seismic profiles. Phoenix Tower was just the beginning. His throat tightened, remembering the collapse, the screaming, the bodies pulled from rubble that should never have fallen. Another muzzle flash lit the clearing as Sarah returned fire from behind the tool shed, drawing attention away from Marcus's approach. The front door hung askew from the earlier assault, security system dead, but the hidden panel beneath the floor remained untouched. Inside, his cliff house felt different, violated. Bullet holes punctured the custom windows that had taken him 3 weeks to install. His drafting table lay overturned, years of meticulous calculations scattered like autumn leaves. This place had been his sanctuary, his proof that precision and determination could overcome any odds. Marcus dropped through the floor access, landing hard in the narrow maintenance space between foundation and bedrock. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as he located the weatherproof case containing the drive. His fingers fumbled with the lock combination, Sarah's badge number, the only digits he'd trusted enough to memorize. The case opened to reveal not just the drive, but every document he'd compiled over 18 months of investigation. Hartwell Construction's systematic corruption of seismic data, bribed inspectors, buildings across 6 states designed to fail under specific stress conditions, an insurance fraud scheme that treated human lives as acceptable losses. Footsteps thundered overhead. Voices shouted coordinates. They were inside. Marcus pocketed the drive and grabbed the emergency kit he'd installed during construction, rope, harness, and a single flare. The maintenance access had a second exit, a desperate contingency he'd hoped never to use. The narrow tunnel led directly to the cliff face, emerging beneath the house's main cantilever. He squeezed through rock and steel, emerging into open air 300 feet above the valley floor. The mountain wind hit him like a physical blow, threatening to tear his grip loose before he could clip into the permanent anchor points he'd drilled into living stone. Behind him, the house erupted in gunfire as Sarah made her stand. Each shot echoed off the canyon walls, counting down moments until either rescue arrived or ammunition ran out. Below, more vehicles wound up the mountain road, too far away to help, too close to be reinforcements. Marcus rappelled along the cliff face, following maintenance routes he'd mapped during the house's construction. Every handhold was familiar, every anchor point tested to support loads far beyond human weight. This vertical maze of steel and stone had been designed as his fortress, but now it served as his escape route. The emergency flare ignited with a sharp crack, casting wild shadows across the rock face. Red light danced through the darkness, a beacon visible for miles. If the FBI was really 20 minutes out, they'd see it. If Hartwell's people reached the cliff edge first, the flare would make Marcus an easy target. From his position halfway down the cliff face, he could see the entire battle unfolding above. Sarah's muzzle flashes from inside the house, mercenaries advancing across the deck, Hartwell coordinating the assault from behind armored vehicles, and in the distance, barely visible through the mountain darkness, helicopter rotors caught starlight. The drive felt heavy in his pocket, weighted with the lives that depended on its contents, reaching the right hands. Phoenix Tower's victims deserve justice. The thousands living and working in Hartwell's compromised buildings deserved warning. Marcus pressed against the rock face and waited for the sky to fall.